I used to think paranoia was something that happened to broken people, people who saw patterns in clouds and conspiracy in traffic lights. But now I know it's not about what you think is real. It's about what keeps following you even when you pretend you didn't notice it the first time. And for me, it started with a wrong number, just a regular voicemail from someone who mumbled my name like they'd known me since childhood, but I couldn't place the voice. And they said only 5 words before hanging up. It's your turn to remember. I played it again and again, thinking maybe it was spam, maybe someone from the bank or a debt collector using scare tactics. But there was something in the way they said remember that made my chest tighten like a seatbelt locking in a crash. That same night, I came home and found my apartment door cracked open even though I know I locked it. Deadbolt, chain, everything, and nothing was missing. Not my laptop, not the cash in the drawer, not the old watch I keep from my dad, but something had changed. Something subtle, like the salt shaker was in the wrong place or the couch had been nudged 6 inches left. And I stood there for 20 minutes not moving because it felt like the room had been paused mid-scene and I had just walked into someone else's memory. I told myself I was tired, that I'd left the door open by accident, that the message was just coincidence. But I started noticing other things too, reflections in windows that didn't match my posture. People in photos with their faces blurred only around me, and a man with a scar over his left eyebrow who started showing up in places he had no reason to be. First in line behind me at a coffee shop, then outside my office building smoking a cigarette with his head tilted like he was waiting for me to say something, and once, just once, I saw him standing across the street from my apartment at 3:12 a.m., not moving, not blinking, just watching through the rain like it didn't matter he was getting soaked through his coat. I called the police once, told them someone might be following me, but the moment I described the scar they went quiet, asked if I was sure I hadn't seen that man in a dream, and when I asked why that would matter, they just told me to get some rest and hung up before I could even give my name. 3 nights later, I got another voicemail, same voice, same calm rhythm, but this time they said, the others won't speak, but they're waiting for you. And that's when I checked the photos again, not mine, ones I'd found at the thrift shop down the block. Old black and whites I'd bought because they looked vintage and cool and empty. But now, one of the photos had someone in the background, a man with a scar over his left eyebrow. I didn't throw the photo away even though every part of me screamed to do it, because some sick part of my brain needed to know if the man in the background was going to move, if tomorrow he'd be closer to the camera, if next week he'd be standing in the front row smiling with his head tilted in that same questioning angle like he was silently daring me to admit we had met before. And sure enough, 2 days later when I pulled it out from the drawer where I kept it wrapped in newspaper and folded inside an envelope, he was closer, still blurry, still impossible to make out in full detail, but no longer in the background, now standing in the street, now facing the lens like he knew exactly where it would be pointed and exactly when I'd come looking for him again. I stopped going to work, called in sick 4 days in a row, then just stopped calling entirely because every time I stepped outside someone brushed against my shoulder and said my name like it was a secret, like I had forgotten it wasn't mine anymore. And even when I sat alone in my dark apartment with the blinds shut and the TV off, I could hear it, my name, spoken through the white noise of the fridge, the water pipes, the vents, not loudly, not clearly, but enough to make me doubt whether silence ever truly existed or if it was just what waited in the gaps between their messages. On the 5th day, I left my apartment in the middle of the night with nothing but my phone, my wallet, and the photo in my pocket, thinking maybe I could find where it was taken. Maybe if I stood in that spot long enough, something would come to meet me. Something would offer answers or at least confirm I wasn't unraveling in slow motion. But when I brought the picture to the thrift store where I'd bought it, the woman at the counter looked at it for all of 5 seconds before her hand started trembling and she turned it face down, refusing to touch it again, telling me she'd never seen it before and that her store didn't sell those kind of things. And when I asked her what she meant, she just backed into the back room and locked the door behind her. I sat on the curb outside for almost an hour, staring at the photo, wondering if maybe I was just sleep deprived and spiraling, if maybe this was a break of some kind. But then a boy, couldn't have been older than 10, walked past me, looked at the photo, and without missing a beat said, that man's not supposed to be here anymore, and kept walking like he hadn't just shattered the last inch of distance I had between coincidence and certainty. I ran after him, grabbed his shoulder, asked him what he meant, but he just looked up at me with eyes that were too calm for his age and said, if you don't return the memory, he'll keep moving closer, and then walked away like he'd already forgotten we spoke. That night I got the 3rd voicemail, same voice, same tone, but this time it said something different, something that didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like an instruction. There's a place between streets. Go there. They're waiting for the photograph. I didn't sleep before going. I couldn't. Not when I replayed that voicemail over and realized that the static in the background wasn't just noise but a pattern, a low hum that rose and fell like breath, like it was alive, like it was listening back while I played it. And when I closed my eyes, I kept seeing roads that didn't intersect where they were supposed to, streets that shouldn't exist folding into each other like layers in a book I'd never read but somehow remembered. So I left my building around 3 a.m., the only time the city felt dead enough for something not entirely human to walk beside you unnoticed, and I walked aimlessly for nearly 40 minutes until I turned down an alley I didn't recognize, one that didn't appear on my phone's map, one that bent too sharply and stretched too far for the block it was on, and halfway through it, all the streets street noise behind me vanished like a switch had been flipped, like I had stepped into a version of the city that had been paused or quarantined, and at the far end of that alley was a narrow red door with no handle and no markings, just a keyhole carved too deep and too dark to be decorative. I pulled the photograph from my pocket, held it against the keyhole without knowing why, and the door opened inward without a sound, revealing not a room but a staircase, steep and endless and curling down into blackness that didn't feel like shadow but like space, deep, impossible space, and I stepped in without thinking, without questioning, like something in me had already made the decision long before my feet moved. I don't know how long I descended. Time didn't feel real down there, and the air pressed against my skin like I was walking through syrup, like each second resisted me, but eventually the stairs ended at a single bench inside a circular room made of mirrored walls, and across from the bench sat a man. I knew it was him, even before I saw the scar, because his head tilted the same way it did in every photo, because he didn't blink, didn't move, just waited for me to sit across from him, and when I did, he held out his hand without speaking, and I placed the photograph into it because that's what I came to do, because that's what the voice had said, because nothing else made sense anymore. He looked down at the photo, then looked directly into my eyes, and for the first time, he spoke, not with a voice, but with my voice, saying words I didn't understand but felt like I'd spoken in another life, and when he was done, he stood, walked through the mirrored wall like it wasn't there, and vanished into the reflection. I was alone again, but the room wasn't empty, because behind me, where there had been nothing, now stood a filing cabinet, old, rusted, and humming softly like a power line, and when I opened the top drawer, I found thousands of photographs, each labeled with names and dates and places I didn't recognize, but in the center of the drawer, one envelope stood out, unsealed, yellowed, and stamped with my name on the front in handwriting I recognized instantly. It was my own. I opened it with trembling fingers and pulled out a photo of me, sitting in that very bench, in that very room, holding a photo of me, and on the back were the words, "You've returned what wasn't yours. Now take what you forgot." I don't remember standing up. I don't remember walking out of that mirrored room or climbing back up the stairs that weren't supposed to exist, but somehow I ended up in my apartment with the photo still in my hand and the city outside unchanged except for one detail. My phone no longer had any signal, not just no bars, but the time had vanished from the screen, the battery icon gone. Just a black display with one line of text scrolling endlessly from left to right that said, "We remember what you buried," and for some reason that phrase made my chest tighten like I had forgotten something that didn't belong to me, like someone had taken a part of my memory and hidden it behind a wall I never built. And now they were forcing me to knock on that wall and ask for it back. I started seeing things in mirrors, reflections that lagged by half a second, versions of me that smiled when I wasn't, eyes that flicked toward shadows behind me that weren't supposed to be there, and every night when I turned off the lights, I'd hear the sound of paper being shuffled in the next room, soft and steady, as if someone was going through the filing cabinet I never brought home. On the third night, I opened the envelope again, hoping to find something I missed, but a second photo had appeared behind the first, one I swear hadn't been there before, and this time it wasn't of me, it was of my mother, sitting at the same bench, in the same mirrored room, holding the same envelope I was now holding, and my breath caught in my throat because she had died 5 years ago in a car crash in another state, and no one ever told me what she was doing the night before it happened. Only that she'd been acting strange, calling people she hadn't spoken to in decades, mailing sealed packages to dead addresses. The back of her photo had no handwriting, just a red thumbprint, and below it, 3 numbers, 617. I didn't know what they meant, but I began finding them everywhere, scratched into the paint on my mailbox, drawn in condensation on my bathroom mirror, carved into the underside of the drawer where I kept the envelope, and every time I saw those numbers, I'd feel that same hum in my bones, like static passing through my spine, reminding me that this wasn't over, that I was getting closer to something that didn't want to be remembered but had no choice anymore. I stayed up all night scrolling through every photo I owned, every backup, every cloud archive, and in 3 different albums, each from different years, different states, different phones, I found that man with the scar in the background, always watching, always just at the edge of focus, and in one of them, he was standing beside my mother, not touching her, not looking at her, but facing the camera with that same expression, and that's when I realized it had never been about me, it had always been about lineage, about a thread passed from one generation to the next, not by blood, but by memory, by proximity to something that rewrites the world in still images and secret timelines. The final voicemail came the next morning, voice calm, almost kind, and it said, "Now you know what they took from you. The last step is to choose whether to keep it." I didn't answer the voicemail, didn't delete it, didn't replay it. I just let it sit there like a sealed door waiting for someone to touch the handle, because I knew whatever I chose next wasn't going to be reversible, wasn't going to be something I could laugh off later and explain to a therapist as a vivid delusion or a prolonged anxiety spiral, because I had already crossed too many thresholds, already given too many pieces of myself away to pretend I hadn't seen what I saw or heard what I heard or found what I found buried under layers of forgotten paper and rewritten names. And as the sun came up the next morning, I realized I was standing in front of my building without remembering how I got there. The door to my apartment already open, the hallway light flickering like it always does just before something happens that shouldn't, and on the floor inside was a manila envelope identical to the one I'd carried for days, only this one had no name on the front, just the number 6. 617. I opened it slowly, hands trembling not from fear but from inevitability, and inside was one photograph, this time in full color, high resolution, printed freshly on glossy stock, and it showed me standing in that alley. The one with the red door, except behind me in the photo was a second version of me, watching myself open the door like he had done it before and was waiting to see if I'd do it again. And the date on the bottom corner was tomorrow. I dropped the photo, heart hammering, and ran to the mirror, hoping to see something familiar, something that still looked like me, but the reflection blinked one full second after I did, tilted its head the wrong way, and mouthed something I couldn't hear but knew in my bones. You've already chosen. That night, I packed a bag, filled it with only one change of clothes, my ID, the journal with the photographs, and no phone, because I knew there was no signal now that could reach where I was going, no number I could call to bring me back to who I was before. And at midnight, I walked back to the alley, the one that doesn't exist on any map, and the red door was already open, no keyhole this time, just darkness and stairs and the hum that had lived inside my head for days now swelling like it. Finally had permission to sing, and as I stepped inside, I saw 7 benches arranged in a circle, each one facing inward, each one empty except for the one in the center, mine. I sat without thinking, the way people sit when they've reached the end of a ritual they didn't know they were part of, and from the shadows emerged a man with a scar over his left eyebrow. Only this time he wasn't blurry, wasn't distant. He was me. Older, tired, eyes full of memories I hadn't lived yet. And he handed me a single photo, placed it in my palm without saying a word, and turned to leave. I looked down, heart stuttering, because it showed a child I didn't recognize standing in front of the red door with an envelope in his hand, and the name written across the front was mine. But the handwriting was his, and I knew then what they meant when they said it would never stop. You don't break the cycle. You become the next memory someone else will one day have to return.